When President Lyndon Johnson places the Medal of Honor around Forrest Gump's neck, the face belongs to Tom Hanks. But the ceremony was real, the president was real, and the body beneath Forrest's face belonged to a real American soldier named Sammy Lee Davis. Hollywood borrowed the footage of Davis receiving the Medal of Honor and digitally replaced his head with Tom Hanks's. But the film never shows what that body had already survived. Before Davis stood beside the president, he had been thrown from a burning howitzer, struck repeatedly, and knocked to the ground by the recoil of his own gun. Then, with a fractured vertebra and no ability to swim, he crossed a river under fire to reach 3 wounded Americans. And even that was not the end of his battle. So what happened at Firebase Cudgel, and what did the famous scene in Forrest Gump leave out? The footage used in Forrest Gump was recorded at the White House on November 19, 1968. President Johnson was presenting the Medal of Honor to 5 soldiers who had fought in Vietnam. One of them was Sammy Lee Davis. Davis had been only 21 years old when he performed the actions described in his citation. At the time, he was still a private first class serving as a cannoneer with Battery C, 2nd Battalion, 4th Artillery, 9th Infantry Division. His job was to help operate a 105mm howitzer. He was not an infantry officer leading a rescue through the jungle. He was not the inspiration for every part of Forrest Gump's fictional life. The direct, documented connection is the ceremony itself. When viewers watch Johnson place the medal around Forrest's neck, much of what they are seeing is the moment Sammy Davis received that medal. But the reason Davis was standing there began 1 year earlier in a flooded landscape of canals, rice paddies, and heavy vegetation in the Mekong Delta. The location was called Firebase Cudgel, and before the night was over, the artillery position would come close to being overrun. Firebase Cudgel had been established during an operation to find Viet Cong forces operating west of Kai Lay. The position stood in swampy rice paddy country near the intersection of the Sobe Canal and Ong Tai Creek. Water divided the battlefield into small pieces of ground, limiting movement and separating American positions from one another. Battery C had brought in 6 105mm howitzers. Because the ground was soft, the guns had been placed on special firing platforms. Normally, those howitzers would fire indirectly at distant targets. Crews could receive coordinates, elevate their barrels, and send shells over miles of terrain. But the enemy that approached Firebase Cudgel would not remain miles away. South of the creek, an American reconnaissance platoon guarded the firebase's exposed flank. Elsewhere, infantry companies protected the artillery positions. Shortly before 2 in the morning on November 18, mortar rounds began landing inside the base. Then the ground assault started. The official Medal of Honor citation described the attacking force as a reinforced Viet Cong battalion. Enemy soldiers pressed close enough that, in some places, only the creek separated them from the Americans. The reconnaissance platoon south of the water came under intense pressure. Some men reached the narrow footbridge. Others were forced to swim. Several wounded soldiers could not make it back and remained trapped on the far bank. At the gun positions, the artillerymen faced a problem their weapons had not been designed to solve. The enemy was too close for normal indirect fire. The howitzers had to be lowered and aimed almost like enormous shotguns. Davis detected an enemy position firing toward a nearby howitzer. He seized a machine gun and began providing covering fire, giving the gun crew a chance to turn its artillery piece toward the attack. That decision kept the crew working. It also exposed Davis directly to the enemy position. A recoilless rifle round struck the howitzer. The impact scattered the crew, ignited powder charges near the weapon, and hurled Davis several yards into a foxhole. The gun was damaged. The position was burning, and the crew had been knocked away from the artillery piece. Davis had already done what could reasonably have been expected. He had manned the machine gun, covered his crew, and survived a direct hit. But when he regained his senses, he struggled out of the foxhole and returned to the howitzer. The weapon that had just been hit was still capable of firing. The problem was that someone had to load it, aim it, and remain beside it long enough to pull the lanyard. Davis rammed a shell into the gun. Then he aimed at the enemy position and fired. If you enjoy discovering what the movies left out of real military history, subscribe to Forgotten War Stories, because Davis's first shot was only the beginning. The shell Davis used was designed for close defense. Artillery crews in Vietnam carried beehive ammunition for situations in which enemy troops came dangerously close to a gun position. Instead of producing only a conventional explosion, the round released thousands of small metal fléchettes across a wide area. At close range, it allowed a howitzer to function like a massive defensive shotgun. Davis fired toward the enemy recoilless rifle position. The howitzer rolled violently backward and knocked him to the ground. According to a later account Davis gave about the battle, that recoil fractured his third lumbar vertebrae. He had just been thrown by an enemy round. Now his own weapon had knocked him down again, but the enemy assault had not stopped. Davis returned to the gun and prepared another shell. Before he could finish, a mortar round exploded roughly 20 meters from his position, inflicting more injuries. Once again, he got back up. He loaded the howitzer. He aimed. He fired, and the recoil knocked him down again. At this point, seeking medical help would not have been cowardice. The gun had been struck, his crew had been scattered, and Davis had suffered multiple injuries. Instead, he returned to the weapon 3 more times. The Medal of Honor citation credits him with loading and firing 5 shells after the direct hit. Army operational history records that his fire helped silence the recoilless rifle threatening the position. That was the first major payoff of his decision. The damaged howitzer was still fighting. But after its remaining ammunition had been used, Davis heard something from across the creek. American soldiers were calling for help. The voices came from the same southern bank where the reconnaissance platoon had been attacked. 3 wounded Americans were trapped there. Between them and Firebase Cudgel was a deep creek approximately 35 meters wide. Enemy troops remained in the vegetation beyond him. Davis could not swim. By then, he was also suffering from the injuries caused by the recoilless rifle blast, the nearby mortar explosion, and the recoil of the howitzer. He began looking for something that would keep him above the water. He found an air mattress. It was not military rescue equipment. It was simply an object available at the firebase that might float long enough to get a man across. Holding onto it, Davis entered the creek. Enemy soldiers fired toward the water as he made his way to the opposite bank. When he reached the wounded men, the rescue still was not solved. Getting himself across had required the mattress. Now 3 casualties had to be moved back while the enemy continued advancing through the vegetation. Davis stood and fired toward the tree line to stop the Viet Cong from closing on their position. Another American, Private First Class William H. Murray, also helped move the wounded men across the creek. That detail matters because Davis did not complete every part of the rescue alone, and the documented presence of Murray makes the real event no less extraordinary. The most seriously wounded man was helped across first. Davis remained on the exposed side, protecting the other 2. Only after the first casualty was moving toward safety could Davis begin. After reaching Firebase Cudgel, Davis refused immediate medical treatment. He first tried to assist another badly wounded soldier. Then he joined a different howitzer crew and continued firing. Around the firebase, the larger battle was still unfolding. Viet Cong forces had approached from more than one direction. Some had crossed a creek and moved against the eastern perimeter. American infantry positions were under pressure while artillerymen used their guns at ranges far shorter than normal. Helicopter gunships arrived over the battlefield shortly after 2 in the morning. Later, an AC-47 gunship known as Spooky joined the defense, followed by fighter aircraft. The aircraft did not erase the danger instantly. They had to distinguish American positions from enemy troops fighting at close range in darkness, over a battlefield divided by water and vegetation. The attack continued for roughly another hour before the Viet Cong began withdrawing before dawn. Army operational history records 7 Americans killed and 98 wounded during the fighting at Firebase Cudgel. For the defenders, holding the position required more than a single heroic action. Infantrymen, artillery crews, helicopter pilots, and air crews all played a role, but Davis's choices affected 2 parts of the battle directly. By returning to the burning howitzer, he helped eliminate a weapon firing into the American position. By crossing the creek, he helped bring 3 wounded men back from ground the defenders had nearly lost. And after completing both actions, he returned to the guns. Davis was eventually evacuated to Japan for treatment. The Army planned to send him home because of his injuries. He asked to return to his unit. In December 1967, only weeks after the battle, his request was granted. His injuries prevented him from immediately returning to his original work as a cannoneer, so he served as a cook with the unit for several more months. The following year, Davis learned that the surviving men who had fought beside him had recommended him for the Medal of Honor. That brought him to the White House on November 19, 1968. President Johnson placed the blue ribbon around his neck while the cameras recorded the ceremony. More than 25 years later, those images were selected for Forrest Gump.
I am the real Forrest Gump. When the president is putting the Medal of Honor around Forrest Gump in the movie, that is my actual footage from when President Johnson awarded me the Medal of Honor, and they simply put Tom's face over my.
Calling Sammy Davis the real Forrest Gump can create the wrong impression. Forrest Gump is a fictional character adapted from Winston Groom's novel. Sammy Davis was not the single model for Forrest's childhood, football career, relationship with Jenny, running, shrimping business, or encounters with famous Americans. The strongest documented connection is far more specific. The filmmakers used footage of Davis's actual Medal of Honor ceremony and replaced his head with Tom Hanks's face. The movie also changed the meaning of the moment. Forrest receives the medal after running repeatedly into an ambush and carrying several members of his platoon to safety, including Lieutenant Dan. Davis's battle unfolded differently. He was an artilleryman defending a fire support base. He first used a machine gun to cover his crew. Then he returned to a burning howitzer and fired it directly into enemy positions despite being knocked down repeatedly. Only after the gun could no longer continue did he cross the creek and help rescue 3 wounded soldiers. And Forrest's famous decision to show President Johnson his wound was, of course, created for the film. Nothing like that happened during Davis's real ceremony. Hollywood borrowed the image of the medal being presented. It did not recreate the chain of decisions that earned it. That is what makes the scene so strange once the real history is known. When President Johnson raises the Medal of Honor over Forrest Gump's shoulders, Tom Hanks provides the face. But the uniform, the ceremony, and the man standing before the president came from history. That body had already been thrown away from a burning gun. It had risen after the recoil fractured a vertebrae. It had crossed a river when the man inside it could not swim, and after carrying wounded Americans back to safety, it had returned to the battle. Hollywood changed the face, but the history belongs to Sammy Lee Davis. If you want more forgotten war stories that sound impossible but really happened, subscribe and follow us.